Donald Trump told the Iranian people that help was on the way. As protests that had begun organically spread across the country, he stepped in publicly, urging demonstrators to keep going, to take over their institutions, and warning the Islamic Republic not to fire a shot at peaceful protesters. A misspelled, impulsive tweet that nevertheless carried the full weight of American power behind it. For Iranians risking their lives against one of the most brutal regimes on earth, this was not idle talk. When the President of the United States inserts himself into a popular uprising and signals support, people believe him, and they act accordingly. They poured into the streets, unarmed, facing a regime that had already proven it would kill to survive. And then, when the moment of consequence arrived, Trump did nothing. The promise vanished, the regime stayed, and the protesters were left to be beaten, imprisoned, and executed for believing America would not betray them. When a superpower encourages a population to rise up, it assumes responsibility for what follows. Trump's defenders want to pretend his words were meaningless, just rhetoric, just social media noise. But authoritarian regimes do not treat American presidential statements as jokes, and neither do the people suffering under them. Iranian protesters understood exactly what Trump was implying, that the United States was drawing a line, that the regime's violence would be met with consequences. The regime understood it too, which is why it moved quickly and ruthlessly once it became clear that Trump's threats were hollow. When a reporter asked him about the regime's hangings, Trump recognized the deal the regime had offered him, an extreme threat he could publicly cite, which would allow him to retreat from his promises without admitting weakness. He accepted this graceful exit, even as the regime continued its brutal crackdown, leaving him outmaneuvered in the moral arena while the protesters paid the price. Protesters were hunted down, tortured, and executed, precisely because they had exposed themselves in response to a promise that was never going to be fully backed. You cannot light the fuse and then plead innocence when the explosion happens. Trump may not have pulled the trigger, but he loaded the gun, handed out false hope, and walked away while the bodies piled up. Donald Trump spent years savaging Barack Obama for weakness toward the Islamic Republic. He mocked Obama for appeasement, for red lines that meant nothing, for abandoning dissidents and legitimizing a murderous regime. He lumped Jimmy Carter into the same lineage of failure and humiliation. Yet when history handed Trump the same test, he did something worse. Obama's sin was passivity, saying little and doing less. Trump's was charlatanism. He played loosely with Iranian lives, treating their desperation as rhetorical fuel. This was not new behavior. In his first term, Trump loudly threatened to strike Iran, only to pull back at the last moment. He did it again now, issuing dramatic warnings, encouraging defiance, then abruptly retreating and declaring victory. In both cases, the regime called his bluff, understood there would be no follow-through, and proceeded accordingly. Trump now claims the regime caved by restraining itself, but the evidence points the other way. Iran learned twice that Trump's threats were performance. Carter hesitated, Obama drifted, Trump bluffed, and each time ordinary Iranians paid the price for believing he meant what he said. The damage from this betrayal goes beyond Iran. It cuts directly into the credibility of the United States itself, and in that sense, it is even more destructive than Joe Biden's disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, allies were abandoned, but they were abandoned in the collapse of a long, losing war that had already been hollowed out by years of bad policy. What Trump did to the Iranian protesters was different. He manufactured hope where none needed to be manufactured, dangled American power in front of people who had nothing else to protect them, and then vanished when the bill came due. The lesson absorbed by the world is not subtle. America may cheer you on, but when the shooting starts, You are on your own. That lesson will be remembered far longer than any speech about democracy, and it will be paid for in future blood, long after the Iranian streets have gone quiet. Trump's behavior makes sense once you understand what he respects. He does not admire freedom movements or democratic courage. He admires strength, dominance, and the appearance of control. Faced with a choice between an unarmed population begging for help and a ruthless regime willing to kill without hesitation, Trump instinctively sided with power. The Islamic Republic did not frighten him. It impressed him. Its defiance, its brutality, its refusal to bend appealed to his worldview far more than the vulnerability of protesters asking for moral backing. This is why his encouragement evaporated so quickly. Supporting the protesters would have required resolve, patience, and the willingness to accept uncertainty. Accommodating the regime required only silence. Trump did not choose peace. He chose the side that looked strong, and in doing so signaled to every authoritarian on earth that violence works and America blinks. Trump repeatedly claims credit for stopping wars and projecting strength, but the reality tells a different story. The largest ongoing conflict, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, continued without meaningful impact from him. In Iran, he authorized a single strike on nuclear facilities, a visible high-profile action, but limited in scope and strategic effect. Across these examples, a pattern emerges. Trump presents himself as decisive and world-shaping, yet the outcomes often rely on the actions of others, or are only partial measures. His narrative emphasizes appearance over sustained action, framing selective gestures as total victories, while leaving the deeper challenges unresolved. For the audience, the lesson is clear. When Trump claims to stop wars, the evidence shows he prioritizes PR and visible impact over real consequential engagement. Trump's foreign policy decisions often raise questions about who influences his choices and why. In the case of Iran, there are credible concerns that Qatar's interests shaped his approach. The state provided a new Air Force One, and Trump's reluctance to take decisive action coincided with policies that aligned with Qatari preferences. His selective engagement abroad, emphasizing PR wins over high-stakes intervention, mirrors a pattern in which potential influence and optics intersect with decisions that affect foreign populations. These connections cast doubt on whether strategic or moral considerations guide his actions, particularly when promises to support allies or opposition movements go unfulfilled. This was not the first time Trump rattled the saber at Iran only to back down. During his first term, he publicly threatened military action, raised expectations, and then abruptly called it off. He did it again recently. Dramatic warnings, maximalist language, and then a sudden retreat once the regime refused to blink. In both cases, Tehran called his bluff and won. Trump later framed these reversals as strategic restraint or proof that the regime had caved. But the reality is simpler. The regime did not concede, and Trump withdrew. The pattern is unmistakable. Loud threats, no follow-through, and a post hoc narrative designed to save face. This cycle taught the regime exactly how to handle him, and left those who believed his promises exposed to the consequences. What makes this betrayal unforgivable is not restraint, but choice. Trump chose the side of power over the side of the people. Faced with unarmed Iranian protesters risking everything, he talked big, encouraged hope once the uprising began, and then walked away the moment real commitment was required. The regime, brutal and defiant, earned his respect simply by standing firm. The protesters, weak only because they were unarmed, were discarded. This is not realism or prudence. It is moral cowardice. When the regime cracked down, imprisoned, tortured, and executed demonstrators, that blood did not spill in a vacuum. It followed Trump's words, his encouragement, and his retreat. Promises made and abandoned have consequences, and in this case, those consequences were paid for by Iranians who believed America would not betray them yet again. This is the lasting damage Trump leaves behind. More than Biden's withdrawal from Afghanistan, more than any single failed operation, this episode further corrodes America's credibility in the one place it matters most, among people willing to risk their lives based on American words. Regimes learn quickly. They now know that Trump's threats are negotiable, his commitments reversible, and his concern conditional on optics. Dissidents learn something far worse. When the moment comes, they are on their own. Trump did not merely miscalculate. He taught brutal regimes how to manipulate him. And he taught the oppressed not to trust America. That is not restraint. That is not deal-making. It is cowardice dressed up as strength, and it leaves blood on the ground long after the tweets are deleted.